Yeah. So congratulations to all of you for that. We're going to jump right in, and really excited to hear what these guys have to share this afternoon. And then the Q&A will be after that. Let's get that Q&A slide back up, because you can even be voting for questions or adding things in as you hear this talk right now. Some of us are having problems with this link. If you go here and all the questions have nothing to do with anything that we've been talking about, it's not because everyone has lost their mind. It's because you're in the wrong thing. You're you're looking at the questions from our vision night back in the summer. So if you're seeing that, you can go to slido.com. And at the top, there's a box that says, as a participant, you can join, and just type in Truth Over Tribe, and you'll get into the right spot. So if you have questions about that, Bryn's right over there. You can go talk to her. So, all right, we're going to jump in. Welcome Keith and Patrick back to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having us. Like we said, we want to be outside right now. And so the fact you're here means a lot to us, and I hope you'll learn something that helps you in your walk with Jesus. And just because you came out here, I want to start with a kind of spicy story. You guys ready for an interesting story? Don't leave, okay? It is nice outside. So this is about a year ago in Columbia, where we live. There's a yearly diversity breakfast, and traditionally that celebrates the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so it's what you might imagine. There's gospel choirs, there's presentations on his life and the civil rights movement. And normally when this happens, there's our civic dignitaries there. You've got the mayor, you've got business owners, but there's also always students from the local middle schools and high schools. And so last January, it was one of those events, and it was totally normal. There were students there from our local public school. Everything was the same except for one thing. There was a drag performance. And there was a catch, because none of the parents who sent their kids to this event knew that there was going to be a drag performance. And so as you can imagine, word starts spreading around rather rapidly amongst people who had kids there and people who didn't have kids there, that a bunch of children had gone to a drag performance without parental permission. And it then became a kind of national news story. And all of a sudden, our governor is writing an open letter to the superintendent saying that he's made a terrible mistake. And the superintendent doubles down and says, we've had this policy for 50 years. We haven't done anything wrong. We don't plan on changing anything at all. So I have a question for you. What would you do? What would you do?
So many times in our culture, we feel like outsiders, and we have to decide in this situation, what kind of response am I going to have? So let's just put ourselves in the position of some of the people who had to answer that question. Like, for them, it wasn't a theoretical question. It was a personal question that they had to decide something on. So there was one parent who attended our church, and her child is severely autistic. She was so excited for him to be able to go to this, because usually when the school takes field trips, he gets left behind. But his autism is significant enough that he can't have meaningful verbal conversations with his mom. So she couldn't process with him what he saw. And that was really important, because he has a tendency to watch television and then mimic what he sees. Like, he loves stories, but then he just kind of goes and repeats whatever he saw. So now he saw this drag performance, he's mimicking things, she can't talk to him. What would you do if you were her? Or what would you do if you were a school teacher who had just come out of COVID? You felt like instead of teaching, you were just wrangling with students and arguing with parents about masks and vaccines. You didn't really care one way or the other, but everybody felt like it was against you. Now, all the parents of your school are calling you upset because of this drag performance. You didn't make the call. You didn't decide this. What would you do if you were that school teacher? We talked to several. What would you do if you were a school board member? We have school board members who are part of our church. Now, they have some authority, and yet they didn't make this decision, and they don't, a school board member doesn't get everything they want. What would you do? How big of a deal would you make out of this? Or how much would you say, I've got to work with these school board members? Other ones, I can't make a big deal out of everything. What would you do if you were just a normal parent, like your kid wasn't there, but you're thinking, this could be my kid the next time? Some said, hey, what we should do is just forget about it. Let's just calm down and ignore it and hope it goes away. Others were writing angry, scathing emails to the superintendent. Again, for you and I here, we just get to, think about this. But for them, this was a decision that they had to make that affected them personally.
And we didn't get to just be armchair quarterbacks. We're pastors in this town. So we had to figure out what we were going to do. And initially, we spent most of our time counseling people just like that, trying to help them figure out what their next step was going to be. And we hoped that the school district would back down, that maybe bridges would be rebuilt. But as time went on, it became clear that that wasn't going to happen. And the long, hard-won trust that had been created between parents and educators inside of our community was rapidly eroding. And so we started talking. We're thinking, what can we do to lower the temperature? Can we make a proposal that would make everybody happy, that would be a win for everybody involved? And so we decided that we would do something we rarely do, which is we would actually speak out about what happened. We ended up writing a op-ed in Newsweek. But the op-ed wasn't an op-ed saying how terrible the school district is because they took these children to a drag performance. Instead, we did something different. We said, can't we all agree on this? Parental permission matters. If you're an atheist and the school is taking your kid to a prayer rally, you have the right to give consent. And if you're a Christian and the school wants to take your kid to a drag performance, you have the right to give consent. And we thought this would be an uncontroversial claim that everybody could agree about, but we knew it was going to be a little bit challenging for people to hear. So we ended up letting the superintendent know when the article came out that it was coming out and said we'd love to meet with him.
Yeah, it turns out if you've never written an op-ed for a major magazine, this was only our second one, and we learned some things. You get to sign off on the words. They'll offer edit suggestions, but you sign off on that. But as far as the pictures they put in or the headline, that's their choice. You as the author of it have zero input on that. So you can imagine that Newsweek, to sensationalize this and get more readers and clicks, they hyped up the sensational aspect of what happened. And like Patrick said, we told the superintendent it'd come out and asked to meet. He said yes, he'd meet with us. We walked in, and we had our main goal walking into his office was, can we make a friend? Can we make a friend? Well, when we walked in, it was the superintendent and a school board member that, let's just say, she's not a big fan of our church. And in the first few minutes, while we were trying to make a friend, they told us that we were similar to people in the Jim Crow South, and that we were increasing the likelihood of the suicide of trans kids. And so we're like, well, this isn't going as well as we thought it might. Like, we hope to lower the temperature, make a friend, build a bridge. It kind of blew up.
You know, our goal, again, to make a friend maybe didn't happen. And in the immediate aftermath, it seemed like we also failed to do anything to change the district's policy. They doubled down. They weren't going to change. Now, a few months passed, and eventually they did change their policy. And so if our goal was to change a policy in the school district, maybe perhaps we played some small role. But if our goal was to build a bridge, to make a friendship, to do something that would heal divides, I'm not sure we succeeded. And you might be surprised we're sharing a story like this. I mean, you don't want to get on stage and tell people, hey, we don't know what we're doing. But why we share it is because living in this world is really complex. And we like to think that there's black and white choices in circumstances, there's right and wrong choices, and of course that's the case in some instances, but in general, life is really gray. And you do your best, and you try to develop wisdom, and yet, it doesn't always work out the way you think it's going to work out. It doesn't always go the direction that you planned for it to go. And that's especially the case when you're like us, and you're outsiders. See, at the end of the day, if you look, even just over the last 15 years, my guess is you feel more like an outsider in your cultural environment than you did 15 years ago. And that makes us all ask a question: why? What's happened that makes us feel as though we are so on the outside?
I think if you do, as a Christian, feel like an outsider, you have legitimate reason for doing so. That's not shocking. You're not necessarily wrong at all. I mean, think about some of the changes that have happened. One of the big changes is just the demographics of our culture have changed. I think the most important book, not the best book, not the most entertaining book, not even the best written book, but I think the most important book written for Christians in 2023 was the book called The Great Dechurching. And it explained how 40 million people, they teamed up, well, let me say this. The authors teamed up with Ryan Burge, a fantastic sociologist of religion, and he's widely respected, written in all the major journals. And they teamed up with him, and what they discovered is 40 million churchgoers have left the church in the past 25 years. 40 million churchgoers left in 25 years. The people who are called the nones, you're probably familiar with this term, N-O-N-E-S, not the nuns that wear habits, right?
Not the habit ones, in Sound of Music.
The nuns are rising. There are more nuns than there are evangelical Christians, who people identify as evangelical Christians. So again, a nun, just to more clarity, is a person when they're asked what faith they are, what religion they are, they just say nothing in particular. That none of the above. It's not like they're atheists, all atheists or anything, just none of the above. But there will soon outnumber not just evangelicals, but Protestants, people who call themselves Protestants. Well, you can imagine that has had a tremendous impact on the demographics of our culture.
It's not just our demographics that are changing, our language is changing. Just 60 years ago, we had a common religious tongue. You could, if you were Billy Graham, have a crusade in the mid-century and say words like heaven, hell, sin, salvation, the gospel, and expect that everybody listening understood what those words meant. And they could even configure them, understand how they all fit together. But of course, today, those words are increasingly meaningless to us. If you see the word sin, it's not usually used to refer to missing the mark of God's plan for your life. It's usually about chocolate. And it's not just that word that's changed. Our entire lexicon, our language for wrongdoing has changed dramatically. Here's our modern lexicon for wrongdoing: harm, toxic, repression. That's how we talk about wrongdoing. Or here's our modern lexicon for goodness: authentic, self-care, being true to yourself. That's how we talk about what it means to be good and do good. And so we've not only changed our demographics, we no longer have a common language for how we talk about the good life, how we think about religion, how we think about the world around us.
Another thing that's changed that makes us feel like outsiders is the moral norms have changed. So 10, 15 years ago, maybe not even that long in some places, you wouldn't have thought of having a drag show at a community diversity breakfast. It just wouldn't have been on anyone's radar. It's not anything you would have thought about. And in the 90s and 2000s, you have people like Miley Cyrus, Selena Gomez, Nick Jonas wearing purity rings. That I wear this ring to save my sexuality for marriage. Now, I don't know what they believed at the time, but they wore those rings proudly because they garnered them respect, right? People respected them for it. It was part of their persona. It wasn't that long ago, only in 2004, that your neighbors to the south, Oregon, they passed a constitutional amendment. The public did, the voters, defining marriage as only between one man and one woman. 2004. It's only 2024. In 2008, Barack Obama campaigned on a traditional definition of marriage. So in a short period of time, the moral norms have shifted, and that causes people to feel like an outsider.
And it's not just demographics, it's not just language, it's not just moral norms. We've seen a major shift in prominence. The prominence of Christians in public life. We could give lots of examples, but here's one that stands out to me. In 2001, after 9/11, there was a memorial service in Washington, D.C. to remember what had happened and those who were lost. And of course, it was Billy Graham, America's pastor, who presided over that service. Just 10 years later, in 2011, there was a 10-year memorial service, and this one was in New York, but there was one catch. No clergy were allowed to speak at the memorial. That's a pretty big difference in just a span of 10 years. And these days, it's not uncommon to hear politicians and media pundits suggesting that anytime someone wants to bring their Christianity into the public sphere, into public life, it's for nefarious reasons. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's in the House of Representatives, said this: The only time religious freedom is invoked is in the name of bigotry and discrimination. It's a pretty bold claim, but I think she's expressing what a lot of people feel. So if you feel like an outsider right now, you haven't taken your crazy pills this morning. You're a sane person. Things have changed in our world. There are shifting demographics. There's shifting language. There are shifts in our moral norms. There are shifts in our prominence. And so you have good reason to feel the way you feel.
And when we feel like outsiders, what do we feel on the inside? And that's usually fear. Fear and anxiety. We get scared. Life is changing. We're not sure we fit in. We're losing credibility. We're losing cultural power. We're afraid for our kids. We're afraid for our grandkids. We're afraid for our future. We can't figure it out. And fear, when we become motivated or gripped by fear or just consumed in fear, fear makes us many things, but one thing it makes us is stupid. Yeah. Like people do really dumb things when they are afraid. There's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. He has this quote. When those deep brain areas are active, they Shanghai your cortical neurons. Your IQ plummets. So when you're afraid, your IQ plummets. Your creativity, your sense of humor, all of that disappears. You're stupid. So they can actually look at your brain and see that when you get afraid, you start making stupid decisions. And I bet you've done that. When you're afraid, you've done really dumb things. Patrick's going to tell you about one guy who did a really dumb thing.
Yeah, this was a particularly dumb thing. There's a guy, his name was Dale, and he had a job at a warehouse, a job he actually really enjoyed. He was a forklift operator, and one day it was a little bit hot in the warehouse, air conditioning wasn't working, and he goes to wipe his brow, and just in that single moment of covering up his eyes, he doesn't see that there's another forklift right in front of him, and he crashes into it. And he gets off the forklift, he looks down, and he can't believe it, there's no damage. His forklift's fine, the other forklift's fine, he wasn't going very fast, no harm, no foul, but it was loud, and so his manager comes down, the foreman, and he says, hey, what happened? He goes, hey, I know there's no damage, but here's the deal, we still need to have you go through all the proper channels, you're gonna have to fill out a form, you're gonna have to go and take a drug test because we need to make sure that you aren't on any drugs during a work accident. And the thing about Dale is that he really liked marijuana. And he did a lot of marijuana. Now, he wasn't on the drug at that point. He did it in the evenings, usually recreationally. But he knew that if he took a test, he was going to fail it. And he was going to lose this job that paid well, that he really enjoyed. And so immediately, he is just stricken with fear. What am I going to do? How am I going to keep this job? How will I have a living? How will I be able to stay in the place that I live? His mind is racing. His heart is racing. His gut is tightening. And he starts looking for a quick fix. A quick fix, literally, because Quick Fix is a synthetic urine manufacturer that he found some of to go into his drug test. And when he gets into the drug test, he pulls out his smuggled Quick Fix synthetic urine and he pours it into the tube and gives it away. And the Quick Fix promises that if you use it, you will pass your drug test. So he's totally confident. I'm going to keep my job. About a week later, his foreman comes down and says, hey, I need to talk to you in my office. And yet again, he's feeling a lot of fear. And the foreman brings him in and he goes, what in the world were you thinking? If you had just failed the drug test, you would have been put on a month-long probation, and then you'd have to take another drug test again. But you gave us fake pee. And as a result, I have no choice. I have to fire you. You see, when we're afraid, we do things we wouldn't normally do. Dale wasn't a stupid guy, and he wouldn't have done that if he wasn't afraid. But when you are afraid, we all have a very similar tendency. We start looking for quick fixes. Maybe not synthetic quick fixes, but quick fixes to try to resolve the tension that we're feeling and get ourselves out of the situation that's causing us so much fear.
And so when we're afraid as Christians, because we feel like outsiders because of all the changes we discussed earlier, what are the quick fixes that we turn to? What are the ways that we try to relieve that tension that we're experiencing? And what we find is that people take one of three approaches. They either accommodate, they eviscerate, or they separate. Accommodate, eviscerate, or separate. Now we're gonna go and try to unpack all of those and explain why we find those things attractive. Here's the good news, is that we're not the first people to struggle with accommodation or evisceration or separation. The Bible is full of people who made that same mistake. So let's just start with accommodation. I think there's so many biblical stories you could turn to, but one that's really well known is when Moses is on the mountain in Exodus 32, and Aaron is down with the people, and the people are clamoring for Aaron to do something. Moses has been up there too long. So what does Aaron do? He accommodates to the pressure of the people. When you accommodate, you let the people, the group, control you. So he makes this idol of golden calf. Now, it's not really an idol in the sense that it's some other god. What he says is, it is Yahweh, the one who led you out of Israel. Now, that was a really foolish decision, but he felt the pressure to accommodate to what everybody was around him was demanding him to do. Well, when we accommodate to the culture that we're in, what is it about it that is so attractive? Well, first, it's quick, right? It's painless. Like, I'm just going to go along with everybody else. Second is that I don't have to change everybody else. Like, I can just change me and my beliefs, and I can go along with it. I don't have to somehow get all these other people to see what I see. And then finally, you're often applauded. Like, you're called savvy or sophisticated, because now you agree with the culture around you. So a lot of Christians, when presented with feeling like an outsider, their response is just to accommodate and make peace with the culture around them.
We don't just accommodate when we're afraid. That's not the only quick fix. We also eviscerate, which is just a way of saying we go on the attack. We go on the offensive. And there's another great story that comes from a similar time in the life of Moses. When he was a young man, he grew up inside of the palace of Egypt. He was a part of the Egyptian court, but he never forgot the fact that he was the son of Hebrew slaves and that the Egyptians were oppressing his kinsmen. And at the very beginning of the book of Exodus, we get this story where he's walking and he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating up a bunch of Hebrew slaves. And of course, this makes him incredibly angry. He wants to attack the person. He wants to make sure that this thing doesn't happen. But if you stop and you think about Moses' psychology for a second, you have to expect that he was also afraid. He was afraid in a very real way of what would happen if he didn't do anything at all. What will happen if no one steps in to stop the Egyptians? What will happen if my people stay in this exact same situation for another 3 or 4 or 5 generations? He was full of fear, and his way of releasing the tension was by going on the attack. We read this in Exodus 2:11. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. Just imagine what he's thinking about as he's watching them. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, looking this way and that. And seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. It's clear that Moses, even at this point, before he gets a commandment that says, "Thou shalt not murder," knows that what he's doing is wrong, right? The guy's looking around. He's kind of making sure no one's walking. What is he trying to do? He thinks that he can jumpstart the revolution. He thinks that if we can just spill some blood, then we can kick these Egyptians out. The Hebrew slaves, we can now be in charge, and we'll resolve the problem. You see, if accommodation is about letting other people overpower you, eviscerators go the opposite direction. They try to overpower other people. They try to take the power from the other people. And that's why evisceration is so tempting, because it promises you power. If I go on the attack, then I'll be the one who has the power. I won't be the outsider. I will now be the insider, and you will be the outsider. But it's not just that. It makes you feel righteous. I mean, Moses was fighting for a good cause. That is undeniable. And oftentimes, when we go on the attack, we might be fighting for something that is good. But the way we're going about it is driven by fear. It's a quick fix, and so it's unwise. Moving beyond that, evisceration promises us catharsis. In the moment, I promise Moses felt great. We all know this, right? When you get angry, even if you're angry at your child and you lose your temper and you start yelling, in the moment it feels good. Like, oh yeah, I finally got them. But then immediately afterward, you think, oh, why did I just yell at them? That was so terribly stupid. But that's part of why evisceration is so attractive. You feel great when you get onto Facebook or Twitter, or you're having the Thanksgiving meal and you say your bit and you get them. And then you have regret a few days later, don't you? Because that's how evisceration works.
Accommodate, eviscerate, and then lastly, separate. And the biblical story that we put with this, but again, there are so many, is Elijah on the top of Mount Carmel. He's up there and he's doing battle with the prophets of Baal. It's a fantastic story. You should go read it if you're not familiar with it. But in this battle with the prophets of Baal, ultimately God calls down fire and Elijah is vindicated. The problem is that not only are the prophets of Baal now upset with him, but so are the Israelites. Like Elijah goes through this whole thing of, I think I'm the only faithful one. I think it's just me against the world. And then Jezebel, who is Ahab's wife, she puts a bounty on Elijah's head. So what does he do? He runs. He runs out into the wilderness and he hides. And that's what separation does. It just says, look, I'm going to separate from society. It has these problems, and I'm going to go over here into my holy huddle and talk to other people who think like me and talk like me and have the same values as I do. And there's something really like good about it. There's something that we like and we find it attractive. Like it's really clear. I can draw a clear line. That's the them, us. We're here. We're in the holy huddle. We speak the language, Christianese, that nobody else quite understands, but we understand each other. It allows me to wash my hands of the world's problems. Like Pilate washed his hands of Jesus because the religious leaders demanded his crucifixion. It's like we get to wash our hands of the problem of this world and go, well, you guys are the fools. If you want to keep going down that foolish road, then you do it. So it offers also kind of clarity. Like it's not gray, right? What Patrick said, that real life is gray and you've got to navigate. You don't always know what the right step is. Separation offers clarity. I just get to do this holy huddle and it's not confusing. It puts this big line between me and them. So you start to wonder, is there any other alternative? I mean, is that all we have? Or is there a better way to handle that feeling of being an outsider?
Yeah, you see, I do think there is an alternative to being a fearful outsider. And you might think, we sometimes think the alternative is being an insider. That's what I have to do. I have to become an insider. But that's not the case. Because God's people have always been outsiders. What if the change God wants us to make is not from outsider to insider, but from fearful outsider to joyful outsider? What if that's the change he's calling us to do? This really hit me a few years ago when I was in seminary and I was doing college ministry at the time. And ministry was hard, and so I was whining. And I was whining to the dean of students, a fantastic guy named Mike Higgins, and I was telling him how great it would be to go to the past. Just 10 or 15 years ago when, there was no controversy around LGBT issues and there was no controversy around every topic that we all get bent out of shape about politically. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to go in the past when basically everybody agreed with me? Now, there's a few things you should know about Mike and I, because we're pretty different. First of all, I was foolish and he was wise. That's the most important thing. Second of all, I was young and he was quite a bit older. Third, I had no children. He had many children. I was a citizen. He was an Army colonel. But perhaps most important for this conversation, I was white and he was black. We had a very different life experience. And in the kindest way possible, he looked at me and he said, "Really? You think that if you and I went back to 1960 Mississippi and talked about orthodox truths around race, it would be easier for you then?" And again, he said it in the nicest way. It was the gentlest of all rebukes. But he went on to make a point that I needed to hear. I was looking for a time when I could be an insider. And that's how we feel, right? Because sometimes we're thinking, gosh, it was so much better 10 or 15 years ago. It wasn't. Nostalgia makes it feel like it was, but there has never been a time in history where Christians have not been outsiders. It is for different reasons in different places. In the era of slavery, you have people like Frederick Douglass and Equiano and all sorts of people who were outsiders because they were advocating for abolition. They were against slavery. You can go forward in history and you will find women who were advocating for temperance, not because they were against alcohol, but because they were against domestic abuse. which is a huge problem with America's drinking. You will find people throughout American history and all of history who identify as Christian, and because they identify as Christians, they are outsiders wherever they're at. And what he showed me is that God doesn't want me to be an insider. God wants me to be an outsider because the Bible is a minority report written by outsiders for outsiders.
Our temptation is to think that being an outsider is new. It's something that we are wrestling with, and this is a new thing. But it turns out that Christians have always been outsiders. Just go back. I know that Wyatt preached, I think, on this topic not that long ago. But go back with me to think through the biblical picture of how Christians have always been outsiders, or a word that I think you've used around here, and it's a good biblical word, is exiles. So you have Abraham, the wandering Aramean, right? And he goes into Canaan, and he's an outsider. He is always in conflict with the people there. Or think about the Israelites when they're in Egypt. They're growing, and so what does the Pharaoh do? He enslaves them. Why? Well, they are the outsiders. So they're the people that we're going to take advantage of to build our Egyptian empire. Or think of the prophets who are standing for God, standing for Yahweh in the middle of a corrupt court. And when the court prophets are all saying, oh, God is on your side, king, God's prophets are speaking truth to power. They felt like outsiders. Or think about when Israel was invaded by Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar comes and he takes the people out of Babylon. He destroys their temple. He kills many people, he lays siege to the city, and he takes a lot of the best and the brightest over to his country, Babylon, and then enrolls them in, maybe you'd call it the Babylonian Leadership Academy. So here you have Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are part of the group that Babylon takes. And there they are learning the language and literature of Babylon. Hey, there they are. Their names have been changed so that no longer do their names remind them of Yahweh, but now they are given Babylonian names that reflect the Babylonian gods. Think they felt a little bit like outsiders? It's the story of the Bible. You could pick up in the New Testament.
Yeah, you know, if you move on all the way to the New Testament, it's full of stories of people being outsiders. But I would start with Jesus. I mean, think about it. Jesus could have been born anywhere. He could have been born to anyone. He could have been born in the halls of power. He could have been born a Roman citizen. But where is he born? He's born in a rural backwater. He was never a citizen of any nation. His parents did not hail from the halls of power. He was an outsider from the start. He was an outsider in his neighborhood because his mom got pregnant before she was married. He was an outsider in Bethlehem. When Herod comes along and hears that there's a king being born, what does he do? He sends a military force to come and murder him. He is then moved off to Egypt, where he lives as an outsider in Egypt because it's not even his own homeland. And then when he comes back and he does his ministry, he's treated by the religious authorities as an outsider. And how is he crucified in the end? His friends abandon him. Eventually, his father turns from him. He is crucified as an outsider. The author of Hebrews makes it really clear. It says that he was crucified outside the gate, which is to say he was taken to the place outside of the city. He was exiled by his own creation and then died for that creation. He was the ultimate outsider.
One of the New Testament books that talks about Christians being outsider is the book of 1 Peter. And it's right at the very beginning where Peter addresses his letter to what he calls our exiles. So again, that's that language of outsider. But what's so interesting about it is that he is calling people who lived in that spot, grew up in that spot, hadn't really traveled much or gone anywhere else. He's calling them exiles. How can you be an exile in your own homeland? Well, it's because these people as Christians had become citizens of heaven. Their citizenship was primarily in heaven with God. So they were outsiders living in their own hometown. They felt like they were out of step with other people. They didn't live according to the cultural norms. And so what Peter tells them is abstain from these certain sins. Live as though you are in exile. So the moral norms have shifted, and you need to stay faithful to Jesus in a culture that's hostile to your norms. to the moral norms. He says to wage war against the sins that wage war against your soul. So fight back, because you are, again, the motivation he gives, you're sojourners, you're travelers, you're pilgrims, you're exiles. And then finally, Peter says at the very end of his book, he's writing this from Rome, by the way, and he says that the people in Babylon send greetings. Well, Babylon, by this time, Babylon, remember there's the people that took Israel captive back in the book of Daniel. Well, Babylon is a much diminished superpower. It's not a superpower at all. It's just a country, normal country. It doesn't really have anything to do with anything right now. So why is Peter saying that he's writing from Babylon? Well, because Babylon has become code. It's become like a word that means more than a country. It means a power that sets itself up against God. And that we all, in a sense, live in Babylon. He was saying Rome is Babylon. Babylon is everything outside of the Garden of Eden. Babylon is where all of us live. And now we need to be faithful as exiles living inside of Babylon. Our citizenship isn't to Babylon. Our citizenship is in heaven.
So, again, if God is calling us to be joyful outsiders, not fearful outsiders, the first step we have to take is what we've been talking about. We have to embrace the fact that God has indeed called us to be outsiders. And by being outsiders, we are kind of like insiders in the great story God has always been telling. When you start embracing the fact that you are actually an outsider, it sets you free from a lot of the fear, because this is where I'm supposed to be. You have to start living into that story. That's the second step. The first step is understand that you're an outsider. The second step is start living in the right story. There's a guy named Hiro Onoda. He was a Japanese soldier in World War II serving the Japanese emperor, and he was sent to an area in the Philippines called Lubang Island. He lands there with a group of other soldiers, and they are immediately under pressure from local military forces, and it forces them to run off into a very thick jungle. And so once they're in the jungle, they start doing guerrilla warfare. But shortly after, on Hiro's hand crank radio, he started hearing transmissions saying that the war had ended, that Japanese had lost, and that the emperor was calling people home. But he didn't believe what he was hearing. He thought it was some sort of propaganda, that people were sending it into the jungle to try to trick him into coming out so that they could execute him and so that he would betray the emperor. And so he refused to come out for another year, for another 2 years, for another 5 years, for a decade, for 2 decades, for 3 decades. He stayed in the jungle with his compatriots, occasionally coming out to fight. Many of them died over the years. Some of them simply disappeared until he was the last man standing. So in 1973, the local government reached out to Hiro Onoda's commanding officer, and they said, "Would you please come down, meet with him, and tell him that the war is over?" His commanding officer agreed. He finds him in the jungle. He tells him the war is over. It's been over for 30 years. You can come out. You can come home. And when he comes out of the jungle, he is weeping. Not because the war is over, but because he realized he'd spent the last 30 years living in a lie. How often do we find ourselves living in a lie, living in a story that's not really real? If our story of Christianity's place in our country is that we're supposed to be the insiders, we're supposed to be the ones in charge, that's the wrong story. And you can spend decades living in that story when the story God wants to tell is, no, your story is that you are in exile. You are an outsider. And you haven't just been called to be an outsider, you've been called to be a joyful outsider.
Can you imagine if you live inside a story that says Christians are insiders in our country? You're constantly going to be disappointed. You're constantly going to feel like you've been let down. Your expectations are not going to be met. But if you understand the story of the Bible that lays out from Genesis 3 on, you realize I'm an outsider, then none of this really shocks you. Like, you can't be offended, you can't be shocked, because you know that this is where Christians have always been. The faithful have always been outsiders. So now we move to step 3, and how do I experience the joy of being an outsider? Well, Patrick showed you earlier how the Gospels show us that Jesus was an outsider. But how did he live his life? Well, Hebrews 12 tells us, for the joy set before him, So he went to the cross for the joy set before him. He experienced joy while being an outsider, while being abandoned, while being betrayed, while being turned against. But being crucified, he experienced joy. And it's interesting because he calls us to do the same thing. So listen to this. Patrick already read the first verse. I'm going to read it again here. This is Hebrews 13, because it's the verse that comes next that tells you and I how we should live. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his blood. So he suffered outside the city. He was the outside. He was the one that was scapegoated. He was the one who was crucified. They said he was the problem. But now listen to this. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach that he endured. So if Jesus was rejected, then he calls us to experience the same rejection, not because we're jerks, but because we're faithful to Jesus. And even though we love the people around us and pray for those who persecute and try to build bridges, it's still, let's put it this way. Jesus did everything right. He said the right things at the right time and the right tone of voice, right? He did it all right, and they crucified him. So you and I, we can do it all right, and we still might get crucified, metaphorically. But we go outside the gate with Jesus. We endure the reproach that he endured, and we do it in joy. Why? Well, because our future is safe in him, right? Like, you can't take anything from me, because what I have is found in Jesus, and he's never leaving me. You can't upset me because Jesus is always with me. So what are you going to take? Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And so if I have Jesus, then I don't need anything else to make my life work. So maybe you take it from me. That's okay. I mean, I'd rather have it too, but if I don't, I'm going to be okay with it. And then finally, I can experience joy because I know that Jesus carries me. Like, he sustains me through whatever it is that I'm going through and whatever reproach I'm bearing. He carries us.
You see, that's the core of being a joyful outsider. Jesus became an outsider for the joy that was set before him. And you can become an outsider for the joy that is set before you, which is not just the future promise of eternity with him, it is the present presence of him with you. And the only people who get to experience that are outsiders. That's who it's for. They're the ones who go outside the camp and bear the reproach with him, because gosh, you know who's outside the camp? It's him, and I want him more than I want anything else. There's a story, it's 1859, Niagara Falls, and there's a tightrope walker, and his name is Charles Blondin. He's a very famous tightrope walker, and he has quite the stunt planned. He's going to tightrope walk across the Niagara Falls. And so he gets onto his rope, and there's a huge crowd of people there to watch him die. And he starts going across the rope. He's using one of those balancing beams, and he's very slowly going, and he gets about halfway, and he starts to wobble, and he sits down in the middle of the rope and pauses. And then he gets back up, and he makes his way across. That was his first trek. But after that, the treks began to be a little bit more complicated because he wasn't done. And for a year afterward, he goes back and forth, back and forth. One time he comes out with one of those old-timey 1800s cameras and takes a picture of all the crowd while he's out there. A different time he comes out and he raises up from a boat below him a bottle of wine and then drinks it. Does not seem wise to me if you're on a tightrope, but he does it. A different time, he puts on a blindfold and goes across a tightrope. He's doing all these stunts. And so one day he comes up to the crowd who wants to see him do it again. He says, "Do you guys believe that I can get across this tightrope?" They all cheer, they roar, "Yes, absolutely." He says, "But do you really believe that I can get across the tightrope?" "Yes, of course you can." He goes, "Okay, if you believe it, raise your hand if you want to get on my back." Of course, no one raises their hand except for one man, and his name was Harry Colcord. And so he lifts up his hand and says, I believe you can get across the rope. I trust you." And when he gets up to Charles Blondin, Blondin leans close to him and he gives him this wisdom. He says, "Look up, Harry. Look up, Harry. You are no longer Harry Colcord. You are Charles Blondin. Until I clear this place, be a part of me, mind, body, and soul. If I sway, you sway with me. Don't attempt to do any balancing yourself. If you do, we will both go to our death. And so Harry Colcord gets onto his back, and he becomes one with Charles Blondin. And when he sways, Harry sways. And when he balances, Harry balances. And in a very similar way, this is exactly what we are invited to do as joyful outsiders. You see, Jesus has already crossed the Niagara Falls. He's gone through death and come out the other side in life. You've seen him do it. You know that it's happened. And now he says, okay, do you believe in me? Get on my back, because that is the only way through. And you climb onto his back and you become one. And he says, when I sway, you sway. When I balance, you balance. And that's what it's like to be an outsider. Because when you're an outsider, you can get onto his back, and yes, it's scary, and yes, you're looking down, and yes, you're terrified, but you aren't the one who's doing the balancing. He is. And there is a profound joy in being with him, a joy you cannot have unless you embrace being an outsider in this world.
I think we're going to do some question and response with Wyatt. So he comes up. Could the rest of us just pray for a moment? Jesus, we want to be joyful outsiders, not because we're smart or wise or confident or courageous or any of that, but because we are one with you. We want to be on your back. We want to be in your arms. We want to be one with you. So we trust that you are with us. We trust that you've gone before us. We trust that you have got us, that you know everything about us, that you love us, that our life is in your hands, your nail-scarred hands. And that's exactly where we want to be. So we are not afraid because we have Jesus. Whatever happens to us, we'll be fine because we've got Jesus. I pray that would be our deep conviction. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, guys. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break. So last chance to vote on questions. We'll put the Slido thing back up there for you. I also just want to tell you real quick, some of the things you'll find out at the resource table. Last chance to buy these resources before we return the rest to Amazon. So Righteous Mind is out there. If you were into what was being talked about this morning with just the way our brains are wired to be tribal, this is an amazing book that'll help you understand so much more about that. Exiles by Preston Sprinkle is out there as well, which is all just about this identity that we've been talking about all day of just being outsiders, being exiles. It really gets into the biblical case for that, and is a great book. Truth Over Tribe, it's okay. I mean, yeah. Just kidding.
It is just okay.
Yeah, so these guys' book, Truth Over Tribe, is fantastic. If you want to go deeper in all this stuff, please pick that up. And then lastly, I'll just remind you that there's this political Christian commitment card out there as well, and just a way to really think about what Jesus is calling us to and how he's calling us to represent ourselves in the political arena, no matter what side of the aisle you find yourself on. Just something for all Christians to get behind. So you can go check that out, grab that. There are cookies out in the lobby and some coffee and all kinds of great stuff. So take 10 minutes, use the restroom. We'll be right back here and jump into the Q&A.
He's alive. As great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee, and thou changest not thy compassions, they fail not. And as thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great, sing it. Great and sun, moon, and stars in their courses above. They join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, your mercy and love. Oh, great is thy faithfulness. Oh, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see, and all I have needed thy hand hath provided. And great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Our creation, we testify, we witness to your faithful Lord, your faithfulness. And you give pardon for sin and a peace that endureth, and thine own depressions to cheer and to guide with strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, and blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. I thank you, Lord, how great is thy faithfulness. Oh, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see, and all I have needed thy hand hath provided. Yes, great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. It's your faithful, you are faithful, Lord. I will sing forever. You are faithful, it's your faithful, you are faithful, Lord. Yes, you are faithful, you're faithful, you are faithful. We testify that you are faithful. You are faithful, yes. But you are faithful, so faithful, faithful. Come weary and tired, worn out from life, and step out of the shadows and walk into light. Come sinner, saint, slave, man, or free, and bring blessings and offerings, then you shall see. Bring blessings and offerings, then you shall see. There is a peace to settle your soul.
All right, friends, welcome back. We are gonna get into the Q&A, and it's not too late to upvote some things, especially down on the list. If you want to move them up before we get there, you can probably influence us a little bit, even still. So we're gonna jump right in. Question 22, or this got 22 upvotes. We're gonna jump straight into a question about Nazis. Are you ready? So here we go. I'm only slightly kidding. What do you do if you sense a major injustice politically, i.e. abortion, race, like Bonhoeffer or Wilberforce? Does God never call us to political action?
I wish we had more time to talk today. If what you took away from this session is that we should be apolitical, bury our heads in the sand, and stop caring about the world around us, we've probably failed. And that could be something you take away when we're trying. Let me say this. What we're trying to do is keep us mindful of first things. And the first thing that matters most is that Jesus is king. He is in charge. That is a fact. Now, what we do after that, as joyful outsiders who aren't afraid, is, well, sometimes we protest. There's a lot of different ways to be politically involved in the world and to change Babylon. In fact, I would argue with you that the most important thing you can do politically is probably not going to happen in the voting booth in November. You see, a politic is just how we organize our lives together, how we deal with our finances, how we deal with those who are rich and those who are poor, how we deal with injustices and problems, how we treat those who hurt us. These are just normal political questions that all human communities have to answer. And I think our calling, according to the Bible, is both to resist Babylon, that's what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 52, to say, hey, this is wrong, we need to change it, but also to cultivate Babylon. Jeremiah 29, build vineyards and houses. And so we can do that in a lot of different ways. I think sometimes we want a one-size-fits-all way to engage the world, but we're all very different. We have different personalities. And so sometimes there will be people who do things that make you feel uncomfortable, but they are being very faithful. A great example of that is, let's use the story that we shared earlier about the drag performance. We had a school board member who was at our church who was trying to navigate this, and he had made a commitment that he wasn't going to make public statements in general about school board-related things because that's not their job, and he was trying to set a good example for other school board members who weren't as virtuous as he was. And so he never said anything publicly. He said, I need to work behind the scenes with other school board members to make changes. And so people were constantly calling him corrupt. You're not speaking out about this. You aren't doing anything about this. You're failing as a Christian. Well, he wasn't. They just didn't know what he was doing. But then there's another guy who works at the state, and he works for the Attorney General's office. And his job is to deal with injustices. And so he used his role to bring lawsuit against the school district for what they had done. He said they'd broken some laws. And people tell him, you're a bulldog, you're mean, you know, you're getting at teachers, you're hurting our school districts. Well, no, that was his way of being faithful. And here's the crazy part. The fact that the state school, the school district put pressure on the school district, which then allowed the school board member behind the scenes to work towards changing that policy. They looked like they were doing opposite things. But they were actually working together. They didn't know each other. They didn't know they were working together. But in God's economy, they were doing different things to work out the common good. And I think we need to realize that just because someone is different than you in how they engage, and they might be the protester holding out the picket sign, that might be the very means God's going to use. But what you do, maybe it's loving the person who they're protesting against. You never know how those two things come together to work out the common good.
Yes, I agree with what Patrick started with. If you heard us say that we should just separate and not worry about politics, that's not what we teach or intend. We think that being involved in politics is a way that you can love your neighbor, because we want our community, our society to flourish. And so that's working for the good of the community. So what we say is that Jesus was political, but he wasn't partisan. Jesus was political, but he wasn't partisan, because Jesus is a king and he's coming to build his kingdom, and kingdoms have politics. And Jesus stood up against injustice. And many Christians throughout the centuries, some he mentioned, or that question mentioned, but others, Dr. King, plenty of others, have also stood in the line of Christians who have worked for the good of the community through political means. But if Jesus is your king, then you will do that in what? In love, in confidence, in peace, in joy, doing what God has called you to do to help your community flourish.
It's great. You guys are starting to find out where I get all my sermon points from on this series. So yeah, there you go. All right, how do you handle yourself in a group of coworkers who are discussing politics when your position is different? Should you just stay silent? Should you try to change the subject?
You fake a seizure. Yeah. And then it all ends. It's all over from that point forward. That's
great.
That's
Yeah.
the easy solution. A group conversation is more complex than a one-to-one conversation. And so, I would not like to give prescriptions for every single situation because they're all so unique. But let me focus one-on-one for a second. One of my favorite things to do when I'm talking to someone about a political topic is just ask them this question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you about your position on this? If they come back and they give me anything between a 7 and a 10, I'm pretty certain that they're not open to changing their mind. And if they're not open to changing their mind, there's really not much value in me arguing with them in the moment. I might feel better, but I won't build a bridge, I won't build a relationship, and I certainly won't open them up to anything new. And so if that's where they're at, I'll probably just ask them questions, try to get them to share their position. And maybe if I'm lucky, they'll ask me to share my position. And who knows, maybe I'll say something that changes their mind. But if they're below, like 7 and below, then I'll often ask a question, what would it take for you to change your mind? What fact would you need? What would you need to hear that would make you say, you know what, I think I'm wrong about this? And again, if they give me something ridiculous, I need God to come out of the sky with a golden tablet. Okay, well, that one's outside of my ability. But if it's a totally reasonable request, I'll go try to find the information. I won't do it right there, but I'll say, that's a great request. I want to go look into that. If I found that, could I give that to you? And then I share it with them. And when I do that, I'm respecting them, and I'm respecting their intelligence, and I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm giving them the opportunity to share, and I'm giving them what they ask me for. And so that's often an approach. I mean, in a group work setting, that might be a little bit different.
Bonnie Christian, who's now one of the editors at Christianity Today, wrote a book that I can't think of the name right now, but we interviewed her on the podcast, and I asked her about this kind of situation because I thought what she said in her book was really interesting. She said you're usually not, in her experience, going to argue someone out of the position. That what it takes is relationship. Relationships pull people in a different direction. So it's not that you never talk about it, but you can only be as controversial or confrontational or direct as the substance of your relationship. So a person that you have trust with, you can say harder things. And a person you don't, I would go the question asking route. Ask them questions, hoping that they'll ask you, but it's not always your responsibility to change everybody's mind. Like you can say your piece, but you don't have to convince everybody that you're right.
That's 100% true, and it means maybe before you speak up, you have to ask the question, is this one of those areas where I actually am called? Like, do I have a relationship here? Like, is there any investment that this person's put into our relationship where they might care what I actually think? Also, how is my mental and emotional state right now? Am I in a position to be able to have a conversation that I'm not going to regret tomorrow? Or is that fear and anxiety and all of that we've talked about really going to drive me to maybe say something stupid, react in a way that's not going to represent myself well or Jesus well? I think that fact that you don't have to right every wrong, you don't have to oppose every position that's wrong in every conversation. God can take care of some things without you.
Especially somebody you work with, because you're probably going to know this person next week and next month and next year, so you can play the long game. You don't have to play the short game.
Yeah, that's good. This is a pastor's trick. I have conversations in the lobby every week with somebody who says something crazy to me, and I just go, thank you for sharing that, and have a great day,
Now everybody's freaking out because they're like, wait a second. No, Wyatt told me thank you last week.
That's Wyatt's wife who says that.
All right. This is a good one. As a teacher, what should we do when faced with teaching a subject matter that goes against our beliefs and faith? Which is another kind of work question, and maybe teachers are the only ones who experience this, but what do you do when your job seems to be requiring that you do something that just doesn't go with your faith?
Two quick thoughts. One is you do need to know yourself and how conscientious you are. there are some people who turn gray issues into black and white issues because that's just how they think in the world, right? Everything is kind of like, and so if you're that kind of person who has a really sensitive conscience, you might want to bring someone else and say, hey, am I reading the situation right? If I do this, am I doing something that's actually wrong here? And ask, is there a creative solution? But here's another piece of advice, and Keith might add something else. I like to call this the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego option. Now, they got thrown into a furnace, so I don't know how well it works, but you still can try it. When Nebuchadnezzar built the gold statue of himself and demanded that everybody bow down to it and worship it, they don't go out with their pickets and protest Nebuchadnezzar. What do? They just don't show up. The event happens, they're not there. Now, someone realizes they're not there and brings that before Nebuchadnezzar's attention, and they get caught for what they did, but they just do a quiet form of nonviolent resistance. This is a very normal way of protesting. So if you're a teacher and you're being asked to do something, I have a piece of advice. Just don't do it and see what happens. Don't tell anybody you're not doing it. It's a form of resistance. You are protesting. If someone brings you to the task, say, hey, here's why I didn't do it. I wasn't comfortable. I didn't make a big thing about it. You can also look for solutions that maybe give you a bit of a workaround. If you have a trusted administrator who you think's in your camp and would understand you, you could go and talk to them and say, hey, I'm not personally feeling good about this. Is there a solution you could help me come up with that would, not put the school in a bad place, not put me in a bad place, not put students in a bad place? I don't want to say anything public. I'm not trying to make a fight. And maybe that person can help you come up with a solution.
That's really good. I think that model of Daniel in exile is so helpful because I think for many of us, we want to go to kind of one of two places. One is if I'm a part of a workplace or a school that has anything that's anti-Jesus in it, then I can't be a part of the system at all. I have to either, have total freedom to say exactly what I think and why these things are horrible, or I just can't even be a teacher here, something like that. And then the other place is the accommodation that you were just talking about of I guess I just don't have any choice but to go along with it. And the example of Daniel in exile is a rejection of both of those things, where clearly they felt comfortable being a part of the system, even though it was a really jacked up system in a ton of ways. But, Daniel and his friends were in the court of the rulers of Babylon who, worshiped all kinds of deities and all kinds of stuff, but they also didn't accommodate. They knew they couldn't do anything that violated their commitment to Yahweh, and I think it's a good model for us as well.
Yeah, I think that's so good. Let's just stay on for a second if we can. Think about what Daniel and his buddies did. They allowed them to change their name. So sometimes we want to draw lines too quick. Daniel, those guys said, okay, you can call me by this Babylonian god name. I can live with that. Then they were in that Babylonian leadership, learning the language, literature of Babylon, the pagan. They served in the system. So there was a lot of gray there. You're not telling me that they didn't have to navigate some really tricky stuff and probably do some things and support some policies that they weren't that excited about.
And they excelled. Right?
They were the best.
They were the best at learning about all of the Babylonian worship practices and their deities and all that. They got A's in that class.
And they rooted for Nebuchadnezzar. When Daniel had to say something hard to Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, man, king, I wish this wasn't about you. I wish it was about someone else. Because he cared about him. Even though Nebuchadnezzar had probably killed his family or destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, he still cared about him. So if you're that teacher, does your administrator who's telling you to do the wrong thing, you love him and you want the best for him, and that you're willing to, you're not making a big deal out of everything, but there were places Daniel drew the line, right? He continued to pray when Darius told him he couldn't. He drew the line at the food in chapter 1. He wouldn't eat it. We don't exactly know why, but he wouldn't eat it. So he drew lines. So make sure you're drawing lines at the right spot. And most of our jobs don't require us to sin against God. I'm not saying it never happens anywhere. I'm saying most of our jobs do not require us to sin against God. But maybe yours does, and these are hard, and maybe you'll have to quit. But be careful. Talk to Wyatt before you do that.
Well, and at least talk to somebody. This is why we have the community, and you brought that up so well.
Your small group, other wise people, let them help you figure it out.
It's really good. All right, you ready for this? So who should we vote for?
Okay. I'm going to ask a better question. Who would Jesus vote for? Okay.
WWJD, this is WWJV.
There you go. You can wear the braces. Who would he vote for? Would he vote for Trump? Would he vote for Biden? Maybe you're really sharp and you'd say, Jesus would vote for himself because obviously he'd be the best candidate. Here's the answer to the question. Jesus can't vote because he's not a U.S. citizen. Now, why that really, really matters, is because it reminds us, it relativizes how important this election is ultimately going to be. I know we said it this morning, but it's worth reiterating. He doesn't need the Oval Office. He has an eternal throne. He doesn't want the demotion. And so here's the deal. You can go out and you can vote, and I vote. I would encourage you to vote. But when you do it, realize you aren't voting for ultimate things. And if I could press even one step further, I would argue, this is a principle called subsidiarity, if you want to look it up, but it's the idea that what's closest to you is what's most important. The areas over which you have the most ability to impact are the areas you should care the most about. So here's the crazy thing. I care far more about our local school board elections than I do about our presidential elections. Because I actually have the ability to influence and impact our schools. I care more about our city elections, our state elections, than I do about national elections. I'm not saying that they're not important, but those are the places where I actually have the ability to influence others. And so I take them with a high degree of seriousness. And most Americans don't do that. Presidential years, huge turnouts. Otherwise, no one's out there voting. And so it's just a piece of advice.
Okay, so I'm going to take it, just amp it up just a little bit. For me personally, everybody gets to have their own test. So you don't have to do this as in the Bible. This is how I think about it, is that a candidate, in order to get my vote, has to pass a character test and a policy test. Now, I think voting is important. As citizens, we should vote. I've always tried to go and vote. But in 2016 and 2020, I didn't feel like either candidate for president passed the test I needed to earn my vote. So I didn't vote for either candidate in 2016. And in 2020, I voted for Kanye West, which didn't turn out to age very well. But he'd come out with the Jesus is King, and I wore his Jesus is King sweatshirt when I preached on Palm Sunday. A couple of my boys are into Kanye. Anyway, it didn't age well. So I would not vote for him either because he didn't pass those tests either, it turns out. So you can vote. Here's what I say. I say that I respect Christians who voted for either candidate with their nose held, right? Like I can critique both sides. I don't think either one of them's awesome, but in my opinion, this candidate, blue or red, passes my test, and here's why I'd vote for them. I had friends who voted for both. I can respect that. I really didn't get people who were Christians who were enthusiastic about either candidate in 2016 and 2020. But that's just me. You can have a different standard, but if we're going to try to get down to something more practical, for me, you have to pass a character test and a policy test.
That's good. I think for me, it's just important to recognize like what kind of bucket this question is in of who to vote for, and that it's in the wisdom bucket. There's not a clear-cut Christian answer to that question where everybody who reads their Bible and loves Jesus is going to come out to the same answer. We're dealing with a lesser of two evils or a lesser of many evils kind of question on this, where there's going to be different arguments on both sides, different values of Jesus that maybe one candidate has more than the other, different values of Jesus that one candidate has much less of than another. And so I care far more about how someone is thinking through that than the answer they get to. And so, I mean, similar to you, like if somebody is saying, man, out of Christian conviction, out of these principles and these values, I know it's not perfect, but I just feel like I'm going to vote for candidate X, I'm fine with that. If the same kind of process gets you to candidate Y, I'm good with that too. But it's not about just getting to the right answer. I have far more respect for somebody who voted differently than me, but out of biblical conviction and out of really reflecting on the scriptures, than somebody who voted the same as me, but just didn't really think about it at all and, watched a campaign ad or whatever, or they were raised a certain way, or they've always voted a certain way, or whatever. Like, to me, it's more about the process than the answer. All right. Should Christians participate in marches or protests? And there's an example given in the question of like the March for Life. And we talked a little bit about the protest, but yeah, I mean, would you, if you had a friend who was saying like, hey, big march this Sunday, this Saturday, like we're telling everybody, we want to get everybody there, like you come on. Like, do you think that's a wise use of our platform, our time?
Yeah, I think it can be. I mean, I think what Patrick was getting at earlier is that God calls the body of Christ. He's equipped us to interact in different ways. Some people are going to be the ambassador who says, I want to change culture by winning people to Jesus. Some people are going to be the discipler, the monk who says, I want to come alongside and disciple people and train people to follow Jesus. And that's the way we're going to change our culture. Some people are the artists who do a beautiful artwork, and that art communicates something attractive and compelling, and they want to change culture that way. Other people come and they're the advisor. Like, they're not the president, but they are the school board president or whatever, but they're next to them, and they've kind of got influence into those conversations. And I think that's legit. And I think one way that's legit is the protester. And I think somebody who goes to a protest and draws attention to evil and injustice in the world is doing something good. I think all those people need to respect that there's multiple ways to influence our culture, and everybody doesn't have to do it my way. So you're not necessarily wrong if you have a different approach to influencing culture than I do. But I mean, if we're going to say protest is wrong, then we're going to have to say that the civil rights movement was wrong. And I don't think anybody wants to say that, right? So we have to have room for protesters within the body of Christ.
Yeah, fun fact, first protesters recorded in history. Do you know who they were?
I do.
Puah and Shiphrah, the two women who were midwives, and when Pharaoh said that the Israelites needed to kill their babies, Puah and Shiphrah protested. They refused to do it, and they did so in a very public and active way. So protest actually comes from the biblical tradition. So it's really hard, I think, as Christians to say, no, I'm against protest.
That's good. What are your thoughts on reciting the national anthem or Pledge of Allegiance?
Oh, Patrick, this question is for you.
If our true and only allegiance is to be to Christ alone. So somebody's tipping their hand a little bit on the question, but I know what Patrick's going to say. Are you on the same page?
No, I mean,
right,
I think he's got a good argument.
Then we got to hear from both of you. I love it. All right, Patrick, you're up first.
Okay. So if we had more time, we would have a whole nother talk where we talk about how Jesus is king, Jesus has a politic, the gospel is a political message because it's the announcement of a good news about a kingdom. We talk about how heaven is in a place where we have this afterlife. I mean, it is that, but heaven is primarily a throne room. It's God's Oval Office. So there's a very political dimension to what we believe. But most importantly, our word faith, we think of as being intellectual belief. But James 2:19 is very clear. It says that even the demons believe and shudder. And so faith, the Greek word is pistis. It's not merely the idea that we give intellectual consent to the truths about Jesus. It's something much deeper than that. In the ancient world, that word faith could also mean fidelity, pledging fealty, or maybe a better word would be pledging allegiance. And so the reason why the early Christians were crucified, I mean, these are people who are paying their taxes, they're taking care of the poor, they're upstanding citizens in every imaginable way, and they're being persecuted. Why? Because they wouldn't pledge their allegiance to Caesar. So if you're going to ask me, will I pledge allegiance, I would personally say that my conscience, and maybe my conscience is too sensitive, but my conscience does not allow me to pledge allegiance to anything but Jesus. When I'm in situations where the Pledge of Allegiance is going on, to be clear, I don't sit down and bury my head or start yelling and shouting because I think this is wrong. I do something I'm very comfortable with. I stand up, I put my hands behind my back to show respect because I do respect our nation and I do have a love of our nation, and I recite the Lord's Prayer in my head because that is the one who gets my allegiance. I don't make a scene about it, and I do the exact same thing whenever I'm doing the national anthem. I'm actually far less comfortable with the Pledge of Allegiance than I am with the national anthem because that seems less like I'm giving myself to something. But at the end of the day, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. There's no flag and republic to which I can give my ultimate allegiance other than Jesus. And so that's why, for me, my conscience doesn't allow it. I don't know if I'm quite in the camp of saying I think it's a sin for other people to do it, but I do need to follow my own conscience. Rebuttal?
And if, no, I mean, I agree with all that. And if,
Oh, you're with me.
if the pledge said, I pledge my ultimate allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, I wouldn't do it. But it doesn't. And I can imagine that we understand that there are different levels of allegiances. And I could be allegiant to a sports team, but that doesn't mean that that's competing with my devotion to God. So if you pledge allegiance to the flag and you feel convicted that you're giving your ultimate allegiance to a country or a nation, then I completely agree that you should not do it. If you can pledge allegiance to the flag and realize that you're giving something allegiance to a country out of a sense of love for a country and loyalty to a country, but it's not ultimate and it doesn't compete with your allegiance to God, then I think you're free to do it. Follow your conscience.
Can I have one thing here? Not to disagree with you. Here's the key. These are things we never even stop to think about. And I think that is actually the bigger mistake. The idea that my allegiance, loyalty, whatever to my country could in some fashion compromise my faith and allegiance to my king and my kingdom, that's a question that the early Christians had to wrestle with. And they were constantly wrestling with. And so, if you're going to sing the national anthem or you're going to pledge allegiance, which you probably don't do unless you're in elementary school, but if you're going to go do that, at least have it stopped and said, why do I do this? And have I thought through this? And am I sure that I'm making a decision that's honoring Jesus in this? And you might end up where Keith's at and say, hey, I don't think this is a big deal. I might end up where I'm at. But that's the right way to go about it.
I guess you could also argue that the early Christians wouldn't say back up. The early Christians wouldn't say Caesar is Lord. And so they wouldn't bow to Caesar in that sense, right? At the cost of their own life, they wouldn't say Caesar is Lord. Now, I would argue that Caesar was literally portrayed as God. And therefore, they shouldn't have did it. They did the right thing because they were asking for Caesar to be God. And if you see the Pledge of Allegiance that way, then you shouldn't do it. Again, follow your conscience. I agree with Patrick. Being thoughtful about it is the most important thing.
Do you know of any portrayals of American heroes as gods in our nation's capital?
Yes. So if you've been to the Capitol and you look up on the ceiling, and what do you see up there at the tallest part, highest part, you see George Washington among the gods.
It's called the Apotheosis of Washington.
So it's the making of a god is what private school Patrick means when he says apotheosis. I'm public
What's
school.
the name of the painting? It's called the Apotheosis of Washington.
I'm public school. Patrick's private school, so you guys pick your side. So yes, we as a country do tend to deify political figures, and we have to be careful of it. So that's why I don't make fun of Patrick for it. I just say, maybe you've overthought it.
He's never said that to me before.
Hey, what I hear you guys saying, though, Patrick, you're not saying that there is no sense in which it's ever appropriate to give some form of allegiance to a country. Are you comfortable with the fact that as a follower of Jesus, we might have more allegiance to our own country than we would to other nations? Or is even that too far for you?
Let me put it this way. If I was sitting in a room with an American who doesn't follow Jesus, and I was sitting in a room with a Chinese person who does follow Jesus, whose nationality do I feel more kinship with? Well, my deepest nationality is as a citizen of heaven. That is at its core who I fundamentally am. And so I actually have more in common with that Chinese citizen than I do with the American. Our fundamental allegiances are the deepest. Now, that said, the Bible's very clear in Isaiah 65 and in the last chapter of Revelation that the nations are going to bring their glories into the kingdom, which is to say, when we are resurrected, we aren't resurrected as a national. I'll be resurrected as an American, whether or not I want to be. That's what I'm going to be, right? And that's what you're going to be. And we are going to bring the best parts of our nation, the best music, the best cuisine, all the things we love about this place. We'll bring that and give it to our King. And there are things I love about this place. There are things that I love about this country. And I will bring those things and give them to him. And so that's just my ordering of how I think through these things.
Yeah. What cuisine are we going to be bringing into the new heavens and earth, you think?
Barbecue, Kansas City barbecue.
Yeah. Beef, lots of it.
That's great.
The best and finest beef.
That's great. we're gonna have to wrap it up here. This has been a great time. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Yeah, let's thank Keith and Patrick. And also thank all of you for spending this afternoon with us. Book table will be open on your way out. Help yourself to more cookies, coffee. Love you guys. We'll see you soon. Thanks.